The third century of the night began as all the others had, in absolute silence. For Dorian, king of the Ashen Court, time was not a river, but a vast, stagnant ocean of gray. He existed within the dead hours, a chasm between one mortal's sunset and another's dawn, a kingdom built of stillness and cold. His throne room was a study in stasis. Dust motes hung frozen in the moonlight that bled through the high, arched windows. The heavy velvet of the drapes absorbed all sound, and the air itself was a frigid, scentless thing. He did not breathe. He did not need to. His heart, a useless stone in his chest, had not beaten in 542 years. This sensory void was the price of his crown, the exchange for a power that felt as hollow as the hunger that was a constant, low thrum beneath his ribs, a cold winter wind that never ceased. He was observing the peace summit from his throne, a spectator in his own court. The mortals, led by Isla's father, General Valerius, were fragile, loud creatures of heat and motion. They pulsed with life, their voices echoing off the cold stone, their scents, sweat, perfume, wine, an assault on his deprived senses. Across the hall stood the human ambassador, Lord Alistair, a man whose life was a frantic ticking clock, his pulse a frantic drum Dorian could hear from across the expanse of marble. It was a sound both agonizing and hypnotic. Beside Alistair stood the high priestess Lyra, serene and ageless in her white robes, a supposed bridge between their two worlds. And then there was Isla. He had felt her the moment she entered the hall. A shock of life, a flare of warmth in his grayscale world. She was nothing like her stern, unyielding father. Where the general was granite, she was a flame. The heat of her radiated in waves, a thermal contrast so stark it made the cold in his own veins feel like a physical burden. Her blood sang a vibrant, defiant song in her veins, the rhythm of it a frantic, beautiful counterpoint to the dead silence of his own existence. The vein in her throat, a delicate blue line against the flush of her skin, was a visual representation of everything he was not, everything he had lost. He watched the subtle tilt of her head, the way her breath misted in the cold air, and felt the ache of the unreachable, a longing so ancient it had become a part of his very being. He wanted to stand near that warmth, to feel it seep into his marble skin, to remember what it was to not be cold. It was a foolish, dangerous thought. The negotiations were a predictable dance of veiled threats and hollow promises, the same steps he had seen mortals perform for centuries. They were so beautifully, tragically fleeting. Their passions burned hot and fast, their lives a brief, brilliant spark in his endless night. He found their earnestness almost tender. Isla argued with her father, her voice sharp with a modern honesty that cut through the archaic formality of the court. She spoke of shared resources, of mutual respect, a language so foreign to these halls of power that it sounded like poetry. Dorian allowed his gaze to linger on her, on the fire in her eyes, the fierce set of her jaw. She was the enemy's daughter, a symbol of the war that had defined the last century of his insomnia. And yet, watching her, he felt a flicker of something that was not hatred. It was awe. Then the world dissolved into white noise and shearing light. The high priestess Lyra had been chanting, her hands raised to bless the treaty, when the runes carved into the floor flared with a violent, unnatural energy. It was not the calm, silver light of her usual enchantments. This was a raw, tearing magic, a shriek that ripped through the very fabric of the hall. Dorian moved without thinking, his ancient speed a blur meant to shield, to cover, but the force hit him like a physical blow, a wave of pure power that cared nothing for immortal strength. The last thing he saw was Isla's wide, terrified eyes. The last thing he felt was the sensory void collapsing into an oblivion that was, for a moment, almost a relief from the weary eternity of being awake. Waking was a slow, disorienting crawl out of that welcome darkness. The first sensation was not silence, but sound. A frantic, rhythmic thumping, impossibly close. Thump, 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 thump. A heartbeat. Not his own, of course, but so near it felt like a vibration against his very bones. The second sensation was warmth. A living, breathing heat pressed against the entire length of his left side, seeping through his clothes, a shocking intrusion into his personal winter. The third was the cold, unyielding bite of metal around his right wrist. He opened his eyes. The grand hall was a ruin of shattered stone and splintered wood. Moonlight streamed through a new, jagged hole in the ceiling, illuminating the still-hanging dust. And there, beside him, was the source of the heat, the sound, the life. Isla. She was unconscious, her head pillowed on the cold marble floor, her dark hair fanned out like spilled ink. Her left wrist was bound to his right by a heavy, rune-etched manacle of blackened iron. The cuff was cold, but her skin beneath it was a furnace. He could feel the frantic pulse in her wrist, a tiny, trapped bird beating against the cage of his proximity. Her scent filled his senses, not perfume, but the raw, elemental smell of life itself, of blood and warmth, and the faint, sweet aroma of her skin. It was intoxicating and agonizing, a feast laid before a man who had forgotten how to eat. He sat up, the movement a silent, fluid motion that pulled her with him. The chain was short, unforgiving. Her body slumped against his, a dead weight of impossible heat. For a creature of stasis, this sudden, forced connection to a creature of change was a profound violation. He was a predator, a being of control and distance, and he was now physically tethered to the one thing in the universe he was most dangerous to. He looked down at their joined hands. His pale and still, hers flushed with life, the delicate veins a map of the vitality he craved. Then his eyes found the body. Lord Alistair, the peace ambassador, lay a few feet away, his fine robe stained with a crimson that was shockingly vivid in the monochrome moonlight. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the ruined ceiling. A ceremonial dagger, one belonging to the Ashen Court, was buried to the hilt in his chest. Dorian felt the trap spring shut around him, a magical explosion, a murdered ambassador, and the vampire king, the ancient enemy, shackled to the daughter of the opposing general. It was a perfect, damning tableau. The silence of the hall returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the hollow silence of his existence. It was the heavy, waiting silence of accusation. And through it all, the only sound was the frantic, terrified beat of Isla's heart, a rhythm that was now, by some cruel magic, the metronome for his own damnation. A groan escaped her lips, a soft, human sound that vibrated through the cuff and up his arm. Her eyelids fluttered. The flame was stirring. The dead hours were over. A new, more terrifying night had just begun. He looked at the vein in her throat, the pulse there a frantic, desperate flutter. The cold winter wind inside his chest howled. Isla surfaced from a sea of ringing silence, her head a throbbing knot of pain. The world swam back into focus as a collection of cold, hard sensations. The unforgiving marble beneath her cheek, the chill in the air that seemed to creep under her skin, the sharp, metallic pressure on her left wrist. A deep, primal part of her brain screamed that she was in a predator's den. The air was wrong, it was dead, holding no scent of dust or life, only the profound, sterile cold of a tomb. She blinked, her vision clearing from a blur of gray and black to the sharp, chiaroscuro lighting of the ruined hall. Moonlight cut through the dust, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Then she saw him, the vampire king, Dorian. He was sitting beside her, unnervingly still, his posture one of ancient, weary grace. He was exactly as the terrifying stories depicted, pale, sculpted perfection, with eyes as dark and deep as a starless night sky. He was not looking at her, but at a point across the room, his expression unreadable, carved from stone. The cold she felt wasn't just the room. It radiated from him, a palpable aura of frost that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. His skin, where it was visible at his collar and cuffs, was the color of flawless marble, and she knew with a sickening certainty that if she touched it, it would feel just as cold. Her gaze followed his, and a choked gasp tore from her throat. Lord Alistair, dead. A dagger, one of the ceremonial blades from Dorian's own honor guard, protruding from his chest. The blood was a stark, wet black against the silver moonlight. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She tried to scramble away, to put distance between herself and the corpse, between herself and the monster. But her arm was jerked back, hard. She looked down. A thick iron cuff, etched with glowing, malevolent-looking runes, encircled her wrist. A short, heavy chain connected it to an identical cuff on Dorian's right wrist. They were bound together. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was chained to the ancient predator, the king of the creatures that haunted her people's nightmares, beside the body of a murdered man. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, wild thing. The sound was deafening in the sudden, pressing silence of the hall. "Do not struggle," a voice said. It was low, resonant, and carried the weight of centuries. It didn't echo. Like everything else about him, it was absorbed by the stillness. "The shackle is unyielding." She flinched, turning to face him fully for the first time. Up close, he was even more terrifyingly inhuman. There was no rise and fall of his chest, no subtle shifting of weight. He was a statue granted the power of speech. His dark eyes met hers, and she felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if she were staring into an abyss that stretched back through forgotten history. There was no malice in his gaze, but something far more unsettling. A profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a being who had seen empires rise and crumble into dust. "What did you do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her survival instincts were screaming, every nerve ending alight with the proximity of a predator whose very nature was anathema to her own. The thermal contrast was staggering. Her own skin felt feverish where it brushed against the cold fabric of his sleeve. He inclined his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I did nothing. We were incapacitated by the same blast that I presume killed him." His speech was formal, archaic, each word chosen with a precision that was unnerving. It was the language of a king, but it was also the mask of an exhaustion so complete it was etched into his very being. "Liar," she spat, the word a small, desperate act of defiance. "This is your court, your dagger. You're the only one who could have—" "If I had wished to kill him," Dorian interrupted, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a soft, dangerous vibration that she felt through the chain, "he would be dead. And you would be a memory." The subtext was clear, a predatory promise wrapped in the velvet of his archaic words. Yet, it wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same tired gravity as his every other utterance. Her gaze fell back to the cuff. The runes glowed with a faint, sickly purple light. "This magic, I know it." She had studied with the high priestess Lyra, had learned to recognize the delicate, powerful weave of temple enchantments. "This is a binding of witness. It can only be placed by a high cleric." Dorian's gaze followed hers. For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, interest, disturbed the placid surface of his composure. "Explain." "It's an ancient rite, rarely used. It binds two people to a single purpose. The cuffs, they won't release until the purpose is fulfilled. Her voice was tight with dawning horror. They are bound to the crime. They will only unlock when the true killer of Lord Alistair is brought to justice. A silence descended, heavier than before. Isla's mind raced. Lyra. The high priestess had cast this. She must have survived the blast. She must believe one of them, or both of them, was guilty. She had shackled the lamb to the wolf and tasked them with finding a killer, when the most obvious suspect was the creature whose cold wrist was bound to hers. It was a death sentence. So, Dorian said, the single words stretching into the quiet. He looked from the body to her, his gaze lingering on the frantic pulse at her throat. His eyes were like black holes, devoid of light, yet she felt his focus as a physical touch. It was the gaze of a being starved not just for blood, but for sensation itself. She was a riot of color in his world of gray, and the intensity of his attention was terrifying. We are to be investigators. The absurdity of it was a bitter taste in her mouth. We are to be enemies, chained together until one of us confesses, she countered, her voice gaining a sharp edge of anger to ward off the fear. Perhaps, he murmured, his eyes still fixed on her. Or perhaps we are simply the two most convenient suspects. He shifted slightly, the smallest of movements, and the chain rattled. The sound was like a funeral dirge. He was so close. Too close. She could feel the utter lack of heat from his body, a void that seemed to pull at her own warmth. It was like being chained to a piece of the night itself. Her heightened, survival-driven awareness was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do anything but sit here, tethered to the embodiment of death. But the iron cuff was a cold, hard reality. There was no escape. There was only him, the dead man, and the impossible task that lay ahead. The night was young, and for the first time in her life, Isla was truly, deeply afraid of the dawn. The first step was an exercise in negotiated misery. Dorian rose in a single, silent motion, the grace of it so profound it was unnatural. The chain yanked Isla to her feet with a stumble, her lesser, human balance a clumsy counterpoint to his stillness. The forced proximity was an immediate, visceral shock. With every breath she took, her shoulder brushed the cold, unyielding fabric of his tunic. The chain forced their hands to remain inches apart, his pale and motionless, hers trembling slightly, flushed with the life he lacked. The air around him was a pocket of absolute cold, a stark reminder of the grave from which his kind arose. He began to walk, his stride long and deliberate, forcing her into a gait that was just slightly too fast for comfort. They moved through the ruined hall, their footsteps, or rather her footsteps and his silence, the only sounds. He surveyed the damage with an ancient, appraising eye, his gaze sweeping over shattered columns and scorched tapestries. The magic was powerful, he stated, his voice a low murmur that did not carry. Chaotic. Not Lyra's usual signature. She was likely injured, Isla countered, her tone sharp. She was hyper-aware of him, of the way he moved without sound, the way his dark clothes seemed to drink the moonlight. Most of all, she was aware of the pulse in her wrist, a frantic drumbeat against the cold iron of the cuff, a beacon of life chained to a vessel of death. The vein in her throat felt exposed, vulnerable. She resisted the urge to cover it with her free hand. Perhaps. The word was noncommittal, but his focus was absolute. He stopped near the ambassador's body, drawing her to a halt beside him. The smell of blood, coppery and sharp, was thick in the air. For her, it was the scent of violence and death. For him, she could only imagine. A subtle tension entered his frame, a tightening in his shoulders that was the only outward sign of the thirst she knew must be stirring within him. His eyes, fixed on the spreading stain, seemed to darken, to deepen. An M dash in his immortal composure. To her astonishment, he did not linger. He turned away, pulling her with him toward the shadows, where the royal guard were beginning to stir, drawn by the explosion. Their faces, as they saw their king shackled to a human, were masks of disbelief and suspicion. Dorian ignored them. His attention was fixed on the captain, a vampire almost as old as the castle stones, named Lucian. "Report," Dorian commanded. The word was quiet, yet it cut through the murmurs of the assembling guards like a razor. Lucian's eyes flickered from Dorian to Isla, then to their bound wrists. "My king, an attack from within the peace circle itself. The high priestess is being tended to. She is weak, but alive. She claims the last thing she saw was the ambassador drawing a blade." A lie. Isla opened her mouth to protest, but Dorian's fingers, the ones on their cuffed hand, brushed against hers. The touch was colder than ice, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through her entire body. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of command. Silence. She obeyed, her jaw tight. "And the general?" Dorian asked, his voice betraying nothing. "He was thrown clear. He is enraged. He accuses you, my lord. He is mustering his men at the city's edge." So her father was alive. The relief was a sharp, painful pang, immediately followed by the dread of his predictable reaction. He would see this as the ultimate betrayal, the very proof of vampiric treachery he had always preached. Dorian's gaze swept over the guards. "Secure the hall. No one enters or leaves. Find out how this magic was corrupted." He turned, pulling Isla along. "We have other inquiries to make." They moved through the cold, echoing corridors of the palace. Every portrait on the wall, every suit of armor standing sentinel seemed to watch them, or rather, to watch her. She was a foreign body in this place of stasis, a creature of warmth and breath in a world of cold and silence. The contrast with a constant, grating friction. She felt his stillness beside her, the utter lack of wasted motion, and it made her own living fidgeting, the slight shifts of weight, the unconscious clenching of her hand, feel loud and clumsy. The proximity was maddening. The short chain forced an intimacy that was both terrifying and strangely grounding. He was a solid, unmoving presence in the chaos. As they walked, the back of her hand brushed against his. The cold was shocking, but beneath it, she felt the unyielding strength of him, like touching ancient stone. The sensation triggered a strange, fleeting image in her mind, not of a monster, but of a mountain, something that had endured for eons, weathered and alone. He led her to his private study. It was a vast, circular room lined with books from floor to ceiling, a library that held the knowledge of forgotten ages. A massive clock stood against one wall, its pendulum still, its hands frozen at midnight. Ticking clocks meant nothing to an immortal. In the center of the room, a single chair faced a cold, empty hearth. There was no clutter, no sign of life or use. It was another shrine to his eternal isolation. He stopped in the center of the room and finally looked at her. The weariness in his eyes was a palpable thing. "Your father will demand my head. My court will demand yours. The high priestess has bound us to a truth that no one, it seems, is inclined to discover." "Someone is," Isla said, lifting her cuffed wrist. "She is." "Lyra is a zealot," Dorian countered, his tone dismissive. "She believes in balance, in justice. She would not orchestrate this. She is a pawn, like us." He paced, a slow, predatory circle that the chain forced her to follow. "The question is, who is the player? My brother Cassian has long coveted my throne. Your cousin Gavin is ambitious and would gladly see your father fall. Any number of lords, human and vampire, profit from this war." He paused, his back to her, and for a long moment he was silent. She watched the rigid line of his shoulders, the utter stillness of his form. He seemed to be looking out the window at the shattered moon, but she sensed his focus was elsewhere, or rather, else when. A memory. a lyrical flashback to a time before the endless night. "There was a time," he said, his voice soft, almost inaudible, "when the sun would warm these stones." He turned his head slightly, his profile etched against the moonlight. "I remember the sting of it on my skin, the heat of it, a pleasant ache. It has been 6 decades since I last tasted salt, 5 centuries since I truly slept." The confession was so unexpected, so raw, that it stole the breath from her lungs. It wasn't a plea for sympathy. It was a simple statement of his reality, the sensory deprivation that defined him. For the first time, she saw past the monster, past the enemy king, and glimpsed the prisoner within, a being trapped in an endless, cold, tasteless, sleepless night. The ache of the unreachable was not just his. For a fleeting moment, she felt it too. The ache for a world he could only observe from the shadows. The winter wind inside his chest seemed to fill the room, and for the first time, Isla felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold of his skin. The journey into human territory was a slow, grinding torment. If Dorian's palace was a silent, cold tomb, the city beyond the castle gates was a cacophony of life that grated on Isla's raw nerves. The smells of baking bread, of sweat, of livestock. The sounds of merchants hawking their wares, of children laughing, of a blacksmith's hammer falling on an anvil. It was her world, the world of the living, and it had never felt so alien. She was moving through it, chained to its antithesis. Dorian moved through the morning crowds like a phantom. The sun was rising, a terrifying approach of dawn for him, but the city's high, narrow streets kept them in deep shadow. He wore a heavy hooded cloak, but it was not enough to hide the unnatural grace of his movements or the profound cold that clung to him. People gave them a wide berth. They saw the chain, the grim set of Isla's jaw, and the shadowed stillness of the figure beside her. Fear was a scent even she could smell, sharp and acrid. They saw her not as their general's daughter, but as a collaborator, a prisoner, a traitor chained to the enemy. The friction between the ancient and the fleeting was a chasm, and she was standing right on the edge. "They fear you," Dorian observed, his voice a low vibration beside her ear. He did not need to raise it to be heard over the din of the city. "They fear us," she corrected, her voice tight. "They see a monster, and a monster's companion." The need to defend herself, to explain, was a burning coal in her throat. These were her people. She had fought for them, bled for them. Now their gazes were like stones. Her family's estate was a fortress within the city, and the guards at the gate crossed their spears, barring their path. Their expressions were a mixture of shock and hostility. "Lady Isla?" one stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief as he took in her strange companion. "I need to speak with my father," she said, her voice more commanding than she felt. "And with my cousin Gavin." The guards hesitated, but the authority in her tone, the ingrained habit of obedience, won out. They were led into the familiar warmth of the main hall, a place of polished wood, roaring fires, and the scent of beeswax. After the sterile cold of Dorian's palace, the sensory input was overwhelming. It felt messy, vibrant, alive. She saw Dorian's head tilt slightly, his senses, deprived for so long, taking in the alien environment. He was a creature of cold stone and heavy velvet, and this world of steam and sweat and sunlight was a foreign country. Her cousin Gavin met them in the hall. He was a sharp, handsome man whose ambition was a poorly veiled cloak. His eyes widened at the sight of the cuffs, a flicker of something, triumph, satisfaction, quickly masked by concern. "Isla! By the gods, what has he done to you?" "He has done nothing," Isla said, the words tasting like ash. She was defending him. The irony was corrosive. "We were framed. Ambassador Alistair is dead, and we've been bound by this curse. We need to find out who was responsible." "Responsible?" Gavin scoffed, his gaze fixed on Dorian with open hatred. "The creature who profits from war stands before you." He took a step forward, but Dorian's stillness was more menacing than any threat. The Vampire King simply watched him, his expression unreadable, and Gavin's bravado faltered. "Where were you during the explosion, Gavin?" Isla pressed, ignoring his posturing. "Here," he said, gesturing around the hall. "With a dozen witnesses. We heard the blast from the castle. We feared the worst." A perfect alibi, of course. The interview was a dead end. Gavin offered condolences and empty promises of aid, his eyes betraying his satisfaction at her predicament. As they left, Isla felt the weight of her people's judgment settle on her shoulders. She was an outcast now, tainted by her association with the ancient enemy. The investigation was not just about finding a killer, it was about reclaiming her own identity. They found a room in a quiet, shadowed inn, a place where the owner was too greedy or too frightened to ask questions. The room was small, stuffy, and intensely human. A shaft of late afternoon sun, the great eraser, streamed through the single window, forcing Dorian into the far corner of the room, a creature of shadow retreating from the lethal light. Isla watched him. He stood perfectly still, a silhouette against the gloom, while she was bathed in the warm, golden light. The contrast was a painful, vivid metaphor for their two existences. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of something she refused to name. It was not pity. It was a dawning comprehension of the sheer scale of his loneliness. He was not just alone in a room. He was alone in a universe that was not built for him, a world of light and life that he could only observe from the encroaching darkness. The chain lay between them, a tangible line connecting their two realities. The bickering had ceased, replaced by a heavy, exhausted silence. The day had been a series of failures, of closed doors and suspicious eyes. They were no closer to the truth. "He is lying," Dorian said, his voice startling her out of her reverie. He hadn't moved a muscle. "Gavin? He had an alibi." "Alibis can be purchased," Dorian replied, his voice flat. But it was not in his words, it was in his pulse. It quickened when he spoke of the ambassador's death, not with fear or anger, with satisfaction. Isla stared at him. He could hear the truth in a man's blood. It was a predator's sense, a tool of the hunt, but he had used it for their investigation. For her. The unspoken hung in the air between them. A fragile, tentative trust was being forged in the crucible of their shared confinement. She looked at his eyes, shadowed and unreadable in the gloom, and saw past the king, past the monster. She saw the weary prisoner, and for the first time, she felt the cold iron around her wrist not as a manacle, but as a connection. It was a terrifying, unwelcome thought, but it was there, a tiny spark of warmth in the cold gray twilight of their predicament. The dead hours reclaimed the world, pulling a blanket of silence and shadow over the living city. For Isla, it was a time for rest, for the body to surrender to the healing oblivion of sleep. For Dorian, it was simply a continuation. The 4th century of the night had begun for him, another long, weary stretch of consciousness in a world that slept without him. He sat in the single rickety chair in their small inn room, the chain a cool, heavy weight connecting him to the bed where Isla lay. He watched her sleep. This was a first. In all his long, sleepless centuries, he had observed mortals in every state of being, in passion, in fear, in rage, in death. But he had never simply watched one sleep. It was the most vulnerable a creature could be, a complete surrender to the unconscious. The rhythmic rise and fall of her chest was a quiet, steady meter in the silent room. Her face, free from the tension and anger of the day, was soft, her features smoothed by peace. A lock of dark hair had fallen across her cheek, and the primal, predatory part of him, the part that was all instinct and thirst, noted the delicate, fluttering pulse in the hollow of her throat, so terribly exposed. But another part of him, something older and more deeply buried, watched with a sense of profound wonder. This was the state he could never achieve. This small death that stitched the days of a mortal life together. Her breath was a soft, warm sigh in the cold air, a sound of life so fundamental it was like listening to the earth turn. The ticking of a clock from the inn's common room below was a faint, insistent sound, a relentless counting of the seconds of her fleeting life, each tick a grain of sand falling through the hourglass of her mortality. To him, the sound was meaningless, an insect's buzz in the face of his granite eternity. But for her, it was everything. The ache of the unreachable was a physical pain in his chest, a hollow space where his heart used to be. He had an almost overwhelming urge to reach out, to brush that stray lock of hair from her cheek, to feel for a single, fleeting moment the warmth of her living skin. It was a madness born of centuries of sensory deprivation. He knew what his touch felt like, the cold of the grave, a touch that leached heat, that promised death. He was a creature of stasis, and to touch her vibrant, changing world was to risk shattering it. His hands, resting on his knees, remained perfectly still. His gaze drifted from her sleeping form to the meager evidence they had collected, laid out on the small table. The ambassador's personal effects, a signet ring, a small ledger, the scorched remnants of the peace treaty. His eyes, honed by centuries of observation in near darkness, noticed something he had missed in the chaos of the throne room. A fine, grayish powder, almost invisible, was clinging to the velvet collar of Alistair's ceremonial robes. He rose, the chain forcing him to move with painstaking slowness so as not to wake her. He leaned over the table, his senses, so different from a human's, analyzing the substance. It had no scent, of course, nothing did. But it had a texture, a resonance to his ancient senses. It was mineral, but also organic. A poison. Specifically, silver root ash, a rare paralytic agent derived from a plant that grew only in the high, sunless crevices of the Dragon's Tooth Mountains. It was lethal to humans, but to his kind, it was merely an irritant. And more importantly, its cultivation and use were a closely guarded secret of the Temple of Perpetual Light. Only the highest echelons of the clergy, those who worked directly with the high priestess Lyra, would have access to it. The knowledge settled within him, cold and hard. This was not the work of a jealous courtier or an ambitious politician. This was a betrayal from the one place they had believed was sacrosanct. Lyra had claimed to be a pawn, but her temple had provided the poison. He looked back at Isla. The moonlight from the window touched her face, tracing the curve of her cheekbone. She murmured something in her sleep, a soft, incoherent sound, and turned, her hand falling open on the pillow. So fragile, so full of a life that was a constant, pulsing miracle to him. In her sleep, she was not the enemy's daughter, not his accuser. She was simply a woman, caught in a trap that was not of her making, her life hanging by the thinnest of threads. A protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, rose within him. It was a feeling he had not experienced since he was a mortal man, a warm-blooded creature of sunlight and foolish sentiment. It was an emotion that had no place in his cold, gray existence. It was a complication, a weakness. He had cultivated his isolation for centuries, finding a strange, cold comfort in his power and his loneliness. But watching her sleep, feeling the faint warmth she radiated even from a few feet away, he felt the walls of that fortress begin to crumble. The chain that bound them was meant to be a punishment, a curse. But as he stood there in the silent, sleeping world of mortals, watching the steady, living rhythm of her breath, he began to feel that it might be something else entirely. A tether. An anchor in the vast, stagnant ocean of his immortality. He looked at his own pale hand, the veins still and silent beneath the skin, and then at hers, where the blood flowed warm and fast. Ice and fire, chained together in the long, dark night. And for the first time in centuries, he felt a flicker of fear, not of the sun, not of his enemies, but of the moment the chain might break. The next day dawned gray and damp, the light a grudging concession that did little to warm the cobblestone streets. Isla woke slowly, the feeling of being watched a prickle on her skin before she even opened her eyes. Dorian was where she had last seen him, in the chair, a statue carved from shadow. He had not moved all night. The concept of a mind that never slept, never found respite, was a dizzying, terrifying thing. It explained the profound weariness she saw in his eyes, an exhaustion not of the body, but of the soul. "Good morning," she said, her voice rough with sleep. The words sounded absurdly mundane in their extraordinary circumstances. "For you, perhaps," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "For me, it is merely a continuation." He gestured with his cuffed hand toward the table. "I found something." She saw the small pile of gray dust on a piece of parchment. As he explained what it was, silver root ash, and where it came from, a cold dread washed over her. The temple. The one neutral power, the one institution both sides had been forced to trust. But why would they? "The war has been good for the temple," Dorian said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Fear drives mortals to prayer. Desperation makes them generous. A lasting peace would diminish their influence significantly." The cynical logic was undeniable, and it made her feel sick. They had been seeking a murderer, but the motive was not personal. It was political, cloaked in the sacred robes of faith. Suspicion, sharp and immediate, fell on the most obvious candidate. "Your brother," Isla said, thinking aloud. "You said he had ambitions, and Cassian has always been devout. He has deep ties to the temple." Dorian's expression did not change, but a new stillness, a dangerous tension, entered his frame. "My brother is many things, a fool, a sybarite, a resentful second son, but he is not a poisoner. It is not his style. He prefers the theatrics of a blade." "We have to be sure," she insisted. "He's the strongest link we have to the temple's inner circle." The journey back to the Ashen Court was even more fraught than their departure. News of their investigation, and their forced partnership, had spread. The vampire court was a viper's nest of ancient rivalries and simmering resentments. Dorian's brother, Cassian, held court in his own wing of the palace, a place of decadent opulence that stood in stark contrast to Dorian's austere, monastic chambers. Heavy damask curtains blocked out all light, and the air was thick with the cloying scent of dried roses and old wine, scents meant to imitate a life the inhabitants could no longer experience. Cassian was lounging on a chaise, surrounded by fawning courtiers, a silver goblet of blood in his hand. He was Dorian's opposite in every way. Where Dorian was still and silent, Cassian was all fluid motion and mocking laughter. He had a cruel, beautiful mouth, and eyes that held a restless, hungry fire. He looked at Dorian and Isla, chained together, and a slow, malicious smile spread across his face. "Well, well, brother," he purred, his voice silken. "What a curious pet you've acquired. Does she fetch?" Isla bristled, but Dorian's grip on the chain, a silent command, kept her from responding. "Cassian," Dorian said, his voice as cold and flat as a winter lake. "We are not here for your tedious attempts at wit. We are here for the truth. Ambassador Alistair was poisoned." He let the words hang in the air. Cassian's amusement faltered for a fraction of a second. He sat up, his eyes narrowing. "Poisoned? The general's men are claiming you tore his throat out." "The claims of fools do not interest me," Dorian said. He stepped forward, pulling Isla with him, their chained hands a symbol of their strange alliance. The poison was silver root ash, from the temple. The name of the poison landed like a stone in the opulent room. The courtiers shifted nervously. Cassian's face became a mask of aristocratic disdain, but Dorian watched his pulse, the faint, almost imperceptible throb in his neck. It remained slow, steady, untroubled. "The temple?" Cassian laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You always did underestimate the little priestess, didn't you, Dorian? You saw a pious dove. I saw a serpent with a crown." He took a sip from his goblet, his eyes glittering over the rim. "But if you think I had any part in her schemes, you are more foolish than I thought. I want your throne, brother. I would challenge you for it, blade to blade, as is our way. I would not stoop to using a human's poison and hiding behind a priestess's robes. It is a coward's plot." He was telling the truth. Isla could see it in his arrogant, sneering face. He was guilty of treason, of ambition, of 1,000 other sins, but not this one. He was too proud, his hatred for Dorian too personal, to use such an indirect method. "But you know something," Dorian stated, his voice quiet but intense. Cassian's smile returned, cruel and sharp. "I know that the High Priestess Lyra was the last person to speak with the ambassador before the ceremony. They had a private meeting in the temple garden. One of my informants saw them. They were arguing." He leaned back, savoring the moment, the power of the information he held. "Perhaps you should ask your precious, neutral arbiter what they were fighting about." The revelation hung in the air, damning and absolute. Lyra. The benevolent priestess, the weaver of the binding curse, the one person they hadn't suspected because she herself had set them on the path to justice. It was a perfect deception. She created the crime, then created the investigation, positioning herself as the righteous authority figure above it all. The dramatic irony was a bitter pill. They had been her puppets, dancing on the strings of her ambition. As they turned to leave, one of Cassian's more brutish-looking guards took a menacing step toward Isla, his lips curled back to reveal his fangs. "A human has no place in this court," he snarled. Before Isla could even react, Dorian moved. He was a blur of black, his body a shield between her and the threat. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stood before the guard, his height and his absolute, predatory stillness a far greater menace. His cold body was a wall in front of her warmth. "Touch her," Dorian said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper that promised an eternity of pain, "and I will erase your name from history." The guard froze, the bravado draining from his face, replaced by a primal fear. He had forgotten that while Cassian played at being a king, Dorian was one. An ancient, powerful being whose wrath was the stuff of legends. He bowed his head and retreated. Dorian turned, his dark eyes finding Isla's. In their depths, she saw the flicker of that protective fire, an emotion that was utterly at odds with his monstrous nature. He had shielded her. He had called her, not the human, or the general's daughter. In that moment, chained together in a palace of enemies, she had never felt safer. The cold of his body no longer felt like the chill of the grave, but like the unyielding strength of a bulwark, a fortress protecting her from a world that had turned against them both. The path back to the temple was a journey into the heart of the lie. The setting sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful, poignant spectacle of a world Isla had taken for granted and Dorian could never touch. Each step they took together, bound by the iron chain, felt heavier than the last. The truth was a weight in the space between them, a grim, shared certainty that had extinguished the last embers of their animosity, replacing it with a somber alliance. The bickering was gone. There was no room for it now. The Temple of Perpetual Light stood on the borderlands between the human city and the vampire's territory, a supposed beacon of neutrality. It was carved from white marble that seemed to glow in the twilight, a monument to a piece that was now revealed to be a carefully constructed fraud. As they approached, the air grew thick with the scent of incense, a cloying sweetness that failed to mask the stench of betrayal. Inside, the grand sanctum was a cavern of chiaroscuro lighting. Candles flickered in recessed alcoves, casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. The air was cool and still, an imitation of the sacred silence of Dorian's court, but it felt different. This was a place that pretended at life, while Dorian's palace was honest in its embrace of death. High Priestess Lyra stood before the main altar, her back to them. She was wreathed in white robes, the very picture of serene piety. She looked as if she were in deep meditation, a holy vessel communing with her gods. Isla felt a fresh wave of sickness roil in her stomach. This woman had been her mentor. Lyra had taught her history, philosophy, the very principles of justice that she was now so grotesquely violating. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any political maneuvering. It was personal. It destroyed a part of her faith in the world. "High Priestess," Isla called out, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. Lyra turned, her movements slow and deliberate. Her face was a mask of gentle concern, her eyes full of a feigned sympathy that made Isla's blood run cold. "My children," she said, her voice the same soft, melodic tone she always used. "Have you found the truth? Has the bond revealed the killer's heart to you?" "It has," Dorian said, his voice flat, cutting through the priestess's sanctimonious facade. He held up their chained wrists. "It has revealed the heart of the one who forged the chain." A flicker of surprise, quickly suppressed, crossed Lyra's face. "The king is mistaken. Grief and suspicion have clouded his judgment." "There is no grief," Dorian stated. "Only clarity. Silver root ash on the ambassador's robes, a poison only you could procure. A private argument with him in the garden moments before the ceremony. A binding spell that conveniently placed the two most powerful symbols of opposition, the vampire king and the general's daughter, together in a cage of suspicion." He laid out the facts like stones on a grave, each one cold, hard, and irrefutable. Lyra's mask of piety began to crack. A zealous light entered her eyes, the serene calm replaced by a chilling fanaticism. "You see only the pieces, not the grand design," she proclaimed, her voice rising, losing its melodic quality and taking on a sharp, strident edge. "Peace is a lie. It is a stagnant pond that breeds complacency and weakness. War is the fire that purges. It makes both your kinds stronger, culling the weak, forcing the noble to rise. Your pathetic treaty would have doomed us to a century of mediocrity. I gave us a future of struggle, of glory, of purpose." "You gave us bloodshed and called it salvation," Isla retorted, her voice shaking with rage. "You murdered a good man and called it a grand design. You are not a priestess. You are a butcher, hiding behind an altar." The truth was out, ugly and profane in the holy space. Lyra's face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. "You were supposed to kill each other," she shrieked, the sound echoing off the marble walls. "The vampire in his thirst, the human in her fear. The binding was meant to be your execution chamber, a perfect, self-contained tragedy that would fuel the flames of this war for another generation. But you refused to play your parts." She raised her hands, and the runes carved into the floor around them. The altar began to glow. Not with the gentle silver light of healing, but with the same violent, malevolent energy that had caused the explosion. "The bond of witness will now fulfill its final purpose," she hissed, her eyes burning with madness. "It will bear witness to your deaths." Magic, raw and untamed, erupted from the floor. A wave of force, a physical manifestation of her hatred, slammed into them. Dorian took the brunt of it, his body an unyielding shield for Isla. He staggered, a grunt of effort the only sound he made, the first sign of exertion she had ever witnessed from him. The chain that bound them, the symbol of their imprisonment, was now their only anchor in the storm of Lyra's power. They had to move as one, think as one, if they were to survive. Isla's heart hammered in her chest, but the fear was different now. It was sharp and clear, honed to a fine point. She was no longer afraid of the monster chained to her. She was afraid for him. The grim, shared purpose that had replaced their bickering had now been forged into a weapon. They were two halves of a single warrior, bound by fate and by their enemy's design. The final act had begun, and the stage was set for a battle they had to win, or their two worlds would be consumed by the fire of one woman's holy war. The sanctum became a whirlwind of destructive energy. Arcs of raw magic, purple and black, lashed out from the altar where Lyra stood, a maelstrom of righteous fury. They shattered marble pillars and sent splinters of stone flying through the air like shrapnel. Dorian moved with a speed that was a liquid blur, pulling Isla with him. The chain was no longer a hindrance. It was a conduit. She learned in an instant to read the subtle tension in his arm, the shift of his weight, anticipating his movements, matching his impossible grace with her own desperate agility. They flowed around an attack, a single entity of shadow and fleeting warmth. Her power is tied to the altar. Dorian's voice was a low command in her ear, felt as much as heard over the shrieking magic. Sever the connection. Easier said than done. Lyra was a vortex of power, and any direct approach was met with a barrage of force that drove them back. They were trapped, forced into a deadly dance of evasion. Another blast slammed into the wall near them, and the impact threw Isla off balance. She stumbled, and for a horrifying second, she knew she was going to fall, to drag him down with her. But Dorian's arm, the one not cuffed, wrapped around her waist, his strength absolute. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, his cold hand a shocking, steadying presence against her back. "I am anchored to you," he murmured, his lips close to her ear, the words a strange, intimate confession in the midst of chaos. "Do not falter." His trust in her, his reliance on her, was a sudden, fierce fire in her veins. He was the ancient, the powerful, but in this they were equals. His strength and her human ingenuity. They had to work together. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for a weakness, a flaw in Lyra's assault. She saw it then, a pattern. Before each major blast of power, the candlelight in the sanctum would dim as the magic was drawn from the runes on the floor toward the priestess. It was a momentary charge, a breath before the storm. "There!" Isla shouted, pointing with her free hand. "She draws power just before she strikes. There's a pulse to it." Dorian's dark eyes followed her gesture. He saw it too. A flicker of understanding passed between them, a plan conceived and agreed upon in the single, shared glance. It was a terrifying gamble. It would require perfect timing and absolute trust. It was an act of ultimate vulnerability. "On the next pulse," he said, his voice grim. "Be ready." They waited, dodging another wave of destructive energy. The candles dimmed. The air grew heavy, crackling with ozone. "Now!" Dorian commanded. Instead of retreating, they charged forward, directly into the heart of the storm. Lyra, surprised by their suicidal advance, hesitated for a fraction of a second. It was all they needed. Dorian used his own ancient power, a wave of pure shadow and cold that met Lyra's magic, a clash of opposing forces that shook the very foundations of the temple. The impact was stunning, buying them a precious few seconds. But it wasn't enough to reach her. They were still 10 feet away when her power began to surge again. The plan required one more desperate move. "My wrist," Isla said, her voice urgent, resolute. "Use the chain!" He understood immediately. It was a horrific risk. To use the chain as a flail, he would have to put an incredible, violent strain on her arm, her shoulder, her very bones. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the complete and total trust she was placing in him. It was her life in his hands, offered freely. He braced himself, planting his feet on the cracking marble. "Hold on," he commanded. It was not a request. He swung their chained arms in a powerful, horizontal arc. For Isla, it was a moment of breathtaking, terrifying force. She felt her feet leave the floor, her body whipped around by his inhuman strength. She grit her teeth against the searing pain in her shoulder, her trust in him the only thing keeping her from screaming. The heavy iron cuff, the symbol of their bondage, became a projectile. It flew through the air, a blur of dark metal, and slammed into the side of the marble altar with a sickening crack. The altar fractured. The connection was severed. Lyra's power, untethered, exploded outward in a chaotic, uncontrolled wave. The priestess shrieked as her own magic consumed her, a final, agonizing cry that was swallowed by a flash of blinding white light. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence that was deeper than any they had known before. The dust began to settle. The last of the candles flickered and died, plunging the ruined sanctum into near total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered ceiling. Dorian and Isla stood in the center of the devastation, their chests heaving, or rather, hers was. He remained perfectly still, a statue in the gloom. The cuff on Isla's wrist felt white-hot from the residual magic, and then, with a soft metallic click, it fell open. The rune-etched iron clattered to the floor. A moment later, his did the same. They were free. The chain was gone. The curse was broken. They stood apart, untethered, for the first time since they had woken in the ruined throne room. The space between them, once a few inches of unforgiving iron, was now a chasm of empty air. Isla took a step back, her shoulder screaming in protest, her body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Dorian did not move. The silence stretched, profound and heavy. The goal that had consumed them, that had forged their unlikely bond, was achieved. The enemy was defeated. Justice, of a brutal sort, had been done. And now? What? He could retreat to his eternal loneliness, to the cold comfort of his silent throne. She could return to her fleeting, vibrant life, to the world of sunlight and warmth, and the father who now had no reason to hate her king. The war was over. Lyra, its secret architect, was gone. Their purpose was fulfilled. Isla rubbed her wrist where the cuff had been. The skin was raw, bruised, but what she felt was not the pain. It was an absence. The lack of the cold, heavy weight was a phantom limb. She felt unmoored, adrift. Her eyes, accustomed to the deep shadows of his world, found him easily in the gloom. He was just a silhouette, a figure of darkness against the pale moonlight, but she could feel his gaze on her, a palpable weight. He should have been triumphant. He had been vindicated. His greatest enemy was vanquished. But the weariness that clung to him seemed deeper now, the loneliness more profound. The cold that radiated from him was no longer just a physical attribute, it was the palpable ache of his soul. In vanquishing their enemy, they had vanquished the only thing that held them together. The cold felt more acute to him now than it had in 500 years. He had grown accustomed to the faint, ever-present spark of her warmth beside him. Its absence was a void. She saw him turn, a slow, deliberate movement, as if to leave, to return to his world of stasis and shadow. And a panic, sharp and unexpected, seized her. The thought of him walking back into that endless, silent night alone was unbearable. The thought of her own world without his steady, grounding presence was suddenly, terrifyingly empty. "Dorian," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the silent temple. He stopped, his back still to her. She took a step toward him, then another. The distance between them shrank. She was no longer his prisoner, no longer his accuser. He was no longer her captor, the monster from the stories. They were simply two people who had walked through a fire together and had come out the other side, changed. "Don't go," she whispered. He turned slowly. In the faint light she could see the conflict in his ancient eyes, the hope warring with centuries of ingrained solitude, the desire warring with the certainty that he would only bring her cold and darkness. "I am a creature of the night, Isla," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "My world has no place for your light." "Then let me share your darkness," she replied, her voice steady, certain. She closed the remaining distance between them until she was standing directly before him. She reached out with her free hand, the one that had not been manacled, and gently touched his chest, over the place where his heart should have been beating. The fabric of his tunic was cold, and beneath it she could feel the absolute stillness of him, the unyielding marble of his skin. But it was not frightening anymore. It was just him. She looked up into his eyes, and with a courage she didn't know she possessed, she tilted her head, baring the delicate, vulnerable line of her neck. The pulse there, once a symbol of her terror, was now a quiet, steady rhythm. It was not an act of submission. It was an act of ultimate trust, an offering. His breath hitched, a phantom reflex, a memory of a biological need, but it was a reaction nonetheless. His dark eyes fixated on the pulse, the vein in the throat. The thirst was there, a shadow in the depths of his gaze, but it was transformed. It was no longer the cold winter wind of hunger. It was a high-stakes emotional hunger, a craving for connection, for the intimacy she was so freely offering. This was the true, emotional catharsis. Not the defeat of their enemy, but this moment of quiet, terrifying vulnerability. He slowly lifted his hand, his cold fingers hovering just inches from her skin. The hesitation carried the weight of centuries, the fear of a man who held the power to break the most precious thing he had ever known. He did not touch her throat. Instead, his fingers gently traced the line of her jaw, his touch as cold and soft as falling snow. His thumb brushed against her lips. A shared breath, one living, one a memory, passed between them. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. It was a connection of ice and fire, of stasis and pulse, a new normal they would have to invent, moment by moment. The war was over, but their story, the one written not in treaties but in the silent language of shared glances and chained wrists, had just begun. He was still a creature of the night and she of the day. But in the twilight, in the quiet moments between the dead hours and the dawn, they had found a kingdom that belonged only to them. The ending was not a fairy tale of sunlight and laughter. It was something deeper, more resonant. A tender melancholy, the beautiful, aching truth of two disparate souls choosing to unite their worlds, finding their light not in the sun, but in each other. Their bond, forged in violence and suspicion, would now be the bridge that ended centuries of bloodshed, proving that the strongest magic was not in curses, but in the simple, terrifying, and profound choice to love.